you'll see a button. You'll see a button on the bottom saying Q&A. Please put your questions in that Q&A. And there's a functionality for upvoting. So we will know what type of questions people have so that Stefano can see the questions, we can see the questions, and we can interject with Stefano if something's not clear. And then if after the 45 to 50 minutes of the presentation, John and I will kind of like collate sort of the most interesting or the most popular questions and give those to Stefano. So again, thank you all for coming today to the first Advances with Field Experiments seminar series, and we hope to carry this on obviously beyond Stefano. So I'll pass it over to John.
Thanks, Rob. And as fate would have it, I think about half of your introduction was actually muted. So I couldn't hear you, and I think a lot of other people couldn't hear you either, but nevertheless, I guess that's par for the course, given the state of the world that we're in. I want to start off by saying welcome, everyone. This is an unprecedented time, and I hope that everyone is safe, remains healthy and productive. And I really want to thank everyone for joining today. This was a thought that Rob and I had that we could give back to the community and bring we field experimentalists together and talk about recent work. And when we started to talk about various people who we would have as our first presenter, it was kind of clear to both of us. There are, of course, brilliant people all around doing field experiments, but it really came to both of us that it should be Stefano. And Stefano is a very old and dear friend of mine. Stefano and I met roughly 20 years ago, and two things really jumped off the screen, so to speak, for me when I met Stefano. And the first one was he has a lot of cognitive ability. Stefano is a very smart guy. And that was importantly complemented with his big heart and also his enthusiasm and infectiousness for economics, using in particular behavioral economics to change the world. And early on, I could see that Stefano was going to be a star. And lo and behold, roughly 20 years later, he has become a star. His work in particular, using theory in behavioral economics, combining theory and experiment and naturally occurring data to show how behavioral economics can be used to understand and change the world, whether it's in IO or in labor. I think he's just made foundational and deep discoveries that we've all learned from. So I want to thank Stefano. Thank you for being a friend, a great co-author, and for agreeing to be our first speaker. So I'll turn it over here to Stefano and say welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad I got that recorded. I'm happy to, very pleased to be talking about RCTs to scale with the exceptional colleague Elizabeth Linos at the Policy School in Berkeley. I want to give a shout out to really outstanding RA Woojin Kim that did a lot of work on this. It's sort of fitting of talking about RCTs to scale as part of a seminar series that is kind of going to scale, right? We're going from like 30, 40 people in a room to some large number of participants. Of course, as part of a field experiment part, I understand that I'm one of 7 contemporaneous speakers. And so I hope that you will upvote this talk, otherwise I will be in the control group forever thereafter. Here is the topic of today. So starting from everybody knows about nudges, this is one of the Taylor and Sunstein definition, is choice architecture that alters people's behavior without forbidding options and without economic incentives. And we sort of can all think of a number of this. This is by no means can be exhaustive, but common examples are simplification and personalization of communication, like in the Borgava-Manoli IRS experiment, or the social norms coming all the way from Cialdini's work on towels to O-Power, what's sort of unusual about nudges is that very soon after nudges became a thing in an academic sense, they were adopted in policy circles. They were, they kind of, their impact turned over to government communications. So in the US, Ideas 42, kind of around 2007, 2008, in the UK, the nudge unit around 2010. And by now, everywhere in the world. So this map where it doesn't matter, you can't read the names, but all of these are nudge units as of even a year and a half ago. So it's really become something that your government, even your state, your city has to be a respectable place to live in. And so the fact that RCT nudges went from being a research idea to being implemented at a very broad level all over the world gives us an opportunity to look at what happened to RCTs going at scale. And I just want to be clear that RCTs going at scale is going to mean different things in different contexts. For example, in development, often people worry about general equilibrium effects, which is not going to be the primary issue here. But I think that we're going to learn from all these different ways of going at scale. And I think there is something that we hope one can learn in this particular setting. Now, the difficulty of doing that is also having a sense of what happened in this nudge unit, because we probably all witnessed some subset of results from there, but it's sort of difficult to get something that is close to a comprehensive view of the results of from some of the nudge units. And so we were thrilled to kind of find very receptive ears from two nudge units, SPST OES, informally the White House nudge unit, and BIT North America, which is the unit that works most with North American cities, opened up all their complete record of every trial that they've run and completed since 2015 on. So basically until mid-2019, we have the record. And I wanna flag this case of transparency, because I think it's hard for us academics to be to this level, and they've just kind of opened up without any guarantee, just all of the record. And I think what's interesting about this is there is both a transparency. So every trial had a trial report, in many cases a pre-analysis plan. And this kind of set of knowledge that we're uncovering was largely not published in academic journals. So 90% of trials is unpublished. Now, some are posted on the website. It doesn't mean that all of this wasn't existing in some way, but I think likely not percolating quite as far and not analyzing this comprehensive way. So that's what we're doing today. So here's the 4 things I'd like to try to do today. In a way, the key thing is, I put it as number 2, which is we're going to talk about what is the average treatment effect of nudges from this nudge units, and I'll talk briefly about that. But before I get to that, I want to talk about what would be the comparable nudges that we get from academic papers on nudges, so that we can compare the two, because in part that's going to be our effort of going at scale, is looking at papers in the academic literature and then looking at their implementation as they get implemented, typically with larger sample sizes in this nudge unit. So that's why I'm going to start from the academic ones and then move to the nudges. And then the third point is going to try to see, can we explain the gap? There is going to be a gap in results. And finally, I'm also going to try to go back to say, how does this relate to what experts and non-experts were expecting the results would be of this paper as part of a research program on forecasting research results that I'm part of. Okay, so where we started is, there is, by all telling, maybe some 2,000 plus, probably now, maybe getting closer to 5,000-10,000 nudge papers that are published in various journals. So no way that we could get all of that, and we didn't want to handpick. So Hummel and Meche is a recent meta-analysis that started from a list of 2,000 papers that had the word nudge in the title or abstract and narrowed it down to 100 papers. So that's going to be one, and these are papers in economics, in health, in marketing, in management. So it's kind of it kind of captures where nudges have gone. It misses a bunch of papers, of course, but it has many of the ones we might think about. And Benarsi et al., which is a smaller meta-analysis that emphasizes the cost effectiveness of nudges, and that also covers different areas, we're gonna take those two because they were the most recent, that were across different applications, not say just health or just, so that's where we start. And then we do the following. we have 102 papers or trials with 253 nudges, where some are lab studies and some are not RCTs. For example, a cafeteria switch from large dishes to small dishes and that's like a time series design. So that brings us down to 52, and a small number of financial incentives, even though they're called nudges, so we'll take those out. Now, here's the next restriction that we have to do. When we collected the data on all the nudges, we had to decide how are we going to aggregate the treatment effects. And so there were going to be two ways. One was to look at the standard deviation, but then sometimes it wasn't obvious what the standard deviation, the control group, and so on. We decided to look at cases where we can measure the outcome as 0, 1. So example would be how many people registered to vote, how many people turn out to vote, how many people recycle, how many people share a link, how many people sign up for retirement savings. A lot of the examples we can think about are basically share of population in control group doing the desired behavior, share of population in treatment group doing desired behavior. We're going to compare those two. But to do that, we're going to need the binary outcome. And that's going to bring down the set of papers that we're going to look at. As you'll see, we lose very few papers in the nudge unit sample. So we're losing some of the published ones, but we're going to lose very few in the other sample. But this allows us to look at everything as a percentage point comparison. Okay. And then finally, and this is less of a restriction than you might think. It turns out in the nudge units, this was a surprise to me, default interventions a la Madren and Shea, changing the default for retirement savings, are almost non-existent, probably because mostly government finds it too intrusive. So that means that even in the published papers, we're not going to compare to those, but we can show what the results are otherwise. So this is like, I'm not going to spend time on this. These are some features in the paper that is posted on my website of some of the interventions. So let me get straight to the point, okay? And then I'll show you some visual evidence in a second. The average treatment effect is 8.6 percentage point of the average nudge. So what does it mean exactly? The average control take-up, think of it as share saving in a retirement plan, is 26%. That's of course the average. It's going to vary quite a bit. The average nudge is, say, increases it from 26 percentage point to 26 plus 8, so 34.6 percentage points. So this 8 percentage point is like a kind of, more than 30% increase relative to the control take-up. In fact, if you do it as log odds, which is close to percent, that would be like more like 50%. So clearly it's a large and clearly statistically significant impact of this. And just to be clear, this is unweighted averages. We can do a meta-analysis, but for reasons that I hope become clear later, I'm just going very simple here and doing unweighted average across the 74 nudges in 26 studies. So maybe to visualize a little bit, I'm going to spend a couple minutes. This is one of the key figures. So on the y-axis, this is the treatment effect. Each data point is a nudge. So the point estimate where that sits, this nudge, for example, had a big impact of increasing the take-up from a baseline of, in this case, about 6 or 7 percentage point to 6 or 7 plus 22. So, about 30 percentage points. This is the 95% confidence interval. So clearly there are some highly effective nudges, some that are close to 0. Basically none that is significantly negative in the published literature. And I flagged just a couple of them. This is active decision, so not a default, but an intervention that you can see. This one is both highly effective and highly precise. Some other ones are more like maybe big effects, more imprecise. And certainly there is also a bunch of zeros too. So the average of the vertical dots is the 8.6 percentage point. Okay, so this is quite literally the raw data, 74 data points out of the 20-something trials. So that's sort of not the key of this, but this is like broadly, as far as we can tell from the academic literature, you would say the nudges can really have these big impacts of maybe 8 percentage points. Now let's talk about point 2. What happens in the nudge units? This is kind of the new data set that we uncover. the two that I mentioned are two of the largest ones in the US. One is the Office of Evaluation Services, which is the name. It actually has continued through the current administration, but it was created under the Obama administration in 2015. This was the executive order that directed to use behavioral science insights to as part of the government decision-making. And they ran 72 trials. All trials have a trial report, and there is a commitment to publish all the results online. And we've kind of come back, and like in the cases where the results weren't clear and so on, we're able to clarify them. That's the first set of the so-called White House Nudge Unit. The second one, BIT North America, was launched at about a similar time in New York as an expansion of the UK team. It works mostly with cities. It ran more than 90 trials. It's actually funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, and it basically provides ways for cities to run randomized trials without bearing the cost of it. So it allows cities to improve government communication, essentially. So these are the two units of which we pull all of the trials that they ran. And I'll show you what those are, but let me give you two examples. This is an example just to think about what are nudge trials. This is a control group for a communication. This was the previous letter for service member, Roth re-enrollment. So it says your action needed in January to continue your election. So this was the communication that the control group was getting. That was basically the previous communication too. And this is what the treatment group that the nudge unit, one of the treatment group studies. You can see that it's a combination of things. It tries to have a loss frame. You must take action to avoid interrupting your retirement saving. It tries to personalize. It has a fresh start. It's a new year. It emphasizes again the loss frame. It tries to do clear action steps, plain language. So this is kind of how they see the interaction, they see the intervention. You can see that this is not going to be the data set which most obviously separates out all the channels, because here there is 4 of them together, but it is going to be a good way to evaluate a sort of what a sort of nudge intervention that tries to take together some of the best of behavioral science does relative to control. And there is different nudge arms because they might still kind of vary some of the combos that they look at. Okay, so we're comparing all of the treatment nudges to the control one. This is another one. This is run by BIT North America instead. This is the control group that the communication that people got to direct them to renew their license plates online. And this was the control one, and the treatment one is simplified. It has the checkbox, so it makes clear, look, you already read this card. Now just only do the steps and you're done. So this is control and treatment. So these are just 2 examples of 120 something trials. This is the sample, okay? We start from 165 trials, 349 nudges, 37 million participants, and almost all of these are RCTs. So we lose a very small number that kind of look more like a different day for clustered RCTs that we couldn't exactly determine the sort of the sample, what the cluster was. Almost all the trials have a control group, but occasionally there are cases where there's no control, and these are all nudges run. It's fine to determine what the most effective one, but it doesn't tell us what the effect of a nudge is, so we have to take those out. 3 trials have something like financial incentives, so we're down to 134. Now you can see here, by targeting only binary outcomes, that was the choice that we made after going through some of this, we're not losing very many. We basically are losing only 12 trials. And that's why we kind of focus on the subset of which one of the primary outcomes is a binary outcome. There might be some that are continuous. It could be participation in retirement savings and share saved. So we don't use share saved, we use participation because we use the binary outcome. It's not obvious that the effect size, given that we do a apple-to-apple comparison of published papers, would be different if we looked at the other ones, but this was kind of a very data-intensive thing to code all of this in detail, so we had to narrow it down in this way. And then finally, you can see that none of the trials, there was basically just 2 nudge arms were true default interventions, which basically switched what would happen to people if they were inertial. Because of that, to our surprise again, we just don't include them, but really there's none of them. So the way to think about it is what we're evaluating as nudges What government units tend to do is changing communication, social comparison, loss comparisons. The changing communication is typically what we look at, not things that are more maybe active, like changing actually the decision mode. Okay, so this is the data set, and there is some difference. I'll come back to it later. Let me show you maybe the first headline result. Remember that we said that in percentage point, the effect of the published nudge papers was 8.6 percentage point. When it comes to the 243 nudges in 126 trials for 24 million people, data set that we put together in collaboration with nudge units, the impact in percentage point is 1.4 percentage point. Now, it's highly statistically significant and very precise, both because we have more studies and the variance is smaller, okay? But it clearly is only a fraction. It's about 1/5 the size of the percentage point estimate in the published papers. And let me be clear again, what it means is the average control take-up is 17. Let's say the share recycling is 17% of people. You move that to 17.4 plus 1.3. So you increase it by about 7%. The log odds ratio gives a little bigger number as a percent because the percent impact is different for cases where the control take-up is smaller. But let's just, to keep things simple, it's 1.4 versus 8.7. So that's part of what this paper is then going to be about. What is it that made the going to scale and so on so different from one to the other?
Stefano?
John and Rob, please chime in.
Yeah, hi, Stefano. So this is excellent. There have been a few questions around the underlying incentives that academics face versus the underlying incentives that nudge units face. And if you could give some flavor around that, I think what people are really asking for is some kind of structure around when you should expect different results. You know, part of it's going to be publication bias, and I'm sure you're going to get to that and try to disentangle exactly what's going on. But beyond publication bias, also, are there fundamental differences in objective functions that can help us understand why there might be differences beyond publication bias, not only in terms of the results, but also what kinds of interventions people take on?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I'm going to have to give only a partial answer to that because I hope in a way that's a kind of discussion that a paper like this opens up. But let me give kind of a couple thoughts. One is, in some ways, it's not as different as one might think because most of the nudge unit interventions are actually conceived with academic research partners that basically connect to people in the nudge unit and design a trial with them. That's kind of a typical mood, for example, for OES, SPST. And then depending on what happens and the implementation, some of those get written up as academic papers. So in fact, 12 of these get written up, not too many, maybe that will grow over time. Some of it is timing of it, but in ways, it's not that different. The nudge unit, both the academics and the nudge units want to get things that are effective, and they also to some extent want to innovate. That's actually true also. Some of the people here in the chat surely have collaborated with some of the units to try to say, hey, these guys have access to a larger sample and an administrative setting, but you still want to do research. So some things are more held constant than you might have thought. But the second thing is there is very reasonable different questions about for example, what we're going to, and this is kind of a point, for example, that is dear to the heart of Richard Taylor, we had kind of discussion recently, there are different things that we're comparing. So in the nudge units, we're looking at the people, we're vetting it. I don't think any of these units is trying stuff that they think is not going to work, but they give it a shot. I think usually they're under such pressure that they're trying only what they think is a reasonable shot at working, like as academics. But even saying that, what we're capturing is everything. Even the things that exposed turn out to be bad ideas. Let me show you an example. This is the same graph as before. This exposed very bad idea. So this was a study that redesigned the web page with good intentions, and turned out we had the wrong psychological intuition backfires. Well, of course, it happens to all of us, right? But if you were an academic, you might say, okay, bad idea. Why would you publish that? Now, somebody might say, oh, no, that's good, so somebody else doesn't try the same. But there definitely are, you could think, if some of this that you're seeing in the nudge unit, you're seeing the bad ideas too. So you're seeing the rare case, you're not seeing that in the published papers. In the published papers, you're seeing the things that you can make sense of. Now, is that publication bias? Is that something else? That I think to some extent we're not going to be able to address. But certainly there's some differences, but I would say fewer than one might imagine. So kind of taking that leap into here, and I'm going to be able to bridge some of that, but certainly there remain a number of differences. You can see here that there is, I want to stress kind of a couple differences. There is many more that are near zero here. So the average of it is 1.4 percentage point. There is a couple positive, there is a couple negative. I'll show you the distribution is pretty normal for this treatment size effects. I also want to stress how much smaller the confidence intervals are. So compare this picture, keep it in mind, let me just flash back to the previous one. You can see here, the confidence interval were much larger. That's gonna be the key part for us of going to scale. One part is gonna be that you get to see all the things run, and the other one is the sample size of the power is gonna be quite a bit larger. So I'll come back to that, but you can see that already here and the possible implications that that might have. So having kind of said that with about 15 minutes left, let me try to mention 4 things, and there could be more. Some of these are catch-all categories. First of all, there could be different characteristics of nudges. We'll talk about that briefly. That's some of it. A major difference, and this is going to be a key thing of going at scale, is you get to work with much larger samples, which in principle, at a minimum, gives you more precise estimate, but it could do more than that. So we'll talk about this. And then we'll talk about something that we're going to call publication bias. This may or may not be the right way to call it. Certainly, we want to include not just whether a journal published it, but also, and mainly, in fact, whether a researcher writes it up, the so-called file drawer effect. But it could also reflect different objective of journals, as in the short conversation John and I just said. And then there is a whole host of other going to scale factors. Things like, are the nudge units more or less careful in implementation? Do they face bigger or larger hurdles? Are they picking the low-lying fruits, like in the in the kind of Alcott O-Power studies, that the first O-Power implementations have bigger treatment effects? Whole host of things. And I'm just want to show you how far we can go in what looks like reconciling, thinking of it in a couple ways. But certainly there is a number of other things that could play a role that we can address only partially. Okay, so the first thing is, let me just maybe show you the second slide. So this is the share. We categorize every nudge paper in a few ways. One that is kind of, I'm going to flag 2. The academic journals have way more that are in-person nudges. You actually contact people in person. Those are likely more effective because the first stage is 100%, right? These are all intent to treat. People may not read the letter or email. So that already could give you some of the difference. Also, this is kind of interesting. The nudge units, for many of them, basically, it starts from simplification. Just getting the government language clear. At least as it's phrased, most of the academic papers, that's not a key part. Maybe because simplification is not deemed interesting enough, whatever it is, but there are some differences even in the observable features of the trials, and I'll show you what that does when we control for it. But maybe the most striking difference, maybe not unexpected, is just the sample size and statistical power. This is the sample size this is a log scale, so otherwise you would see. We would go all the way here to into the Bay Bridge here with right where I am. So you have the academic journals here. The median sample size is 484. That's the number of samples in each of the arms, and in the nudge unit is 10,000. So you have a sample that is 20 times larger. That indeed is one of the major advantages of working with the nudge units. And what this implies is that the statistical power, the MDE, one of the nice features of using this simple setting with percentage point effects, you can compute the MDE exposed by knowing the control take-up, the sample size in control, sample size in treatment. So this is the minimum detectable effect. The median one for published papers is 6 percentage points. Now that's not very, you have to get a pretty big effect so that's kind of what they're powered for. But in the nudge unit, the median statistical power is less than 1 percentage point, which kind of allows you to more reliably detect even some modest size effects. So that's kind of one first difference that I want to keep in mind in light of the next one. So I'm going to then try to hone in more to what could be publication bias, and I'm going to present 2 pieces of evidence on it. There is sort of a third that is related. This is the old-fashioned publication bias that probably goes back to Carden-Kruger meta-analysis of the fast food papers. And this is testing the running a regression of the treatment effect size on statistical power, basically how precise it is. This is you can do it minimal detectable effect, you can do with standard error. Now, what everybody predicts is that as you move to the right, the estimate should fan out because the things become more imprecise. But what this also shows is the point estimates increase. What that would be consistent with, you basically only publish things that are statistically significant or something like that. And so the more imprecision you have, the more the things that get published have larger point estimates. So, and there's certainly, you can see that this would provide some evidence of that. I would say the point estimate is smaller for the cases that are more precise. Now, that's not the modern test. The modern test is more the p-hacking. So basically, a la Brodeur et al. And replication literature, you know, from the Simonson et al. Going down in earlier statistical papers. This plots the distribution of t-stats. And the question is, are you above or below the 5% significant 1.96 for t? Now, if we ran this is the result when you look at nudge by nudge, and it doesn't look like anything, you know, like, but then we were thinking more than in other settings, in these papers, there's almost always multiple nudges. And what would matter for publication is one of the nudges statistically significant, not are they all statistically significant? And that's the next plot. The next plot is the t-statistic for the most significant treatment. Now, obviously the t-statistics of the max treatment doesn't have any well-behaved distribution, but it still shouldn't jump at 196, but it does. Basically, there is only 3 papers out of 25 that are where none of the treatment is statistically significant. And in fact, out of those 3, 2 are emphasizing another result that is statistically significant, but that wasn't the pre-specified or it's a subsample. So in practice, we do find the familiar publication bias, but of a size that is really large, because if you take, it's small samples, but the ratio of the bars to the right to the left suggests that the probability of publishing an insignificant effect is about 10 to 20%. So that's kind of part of it. Now, in the nudge units, there is no such evidence. There shouldn't be, but we better check. So this is the first plot. It's pretty flat. And this is the second plot, either of the two. That's where I said here, the distribution of treatment effects is encouragingly pretty symmetric around the positive estimate, but it is pretty symmetric. So that's kind of the publication bias part. And so now I want to try to put things together. I think I'm in time to say, to what extent do these different things can reconcile the differences? And again, I don't want to say there aren't other things, and this is, but here is how we can think of it. Here's what this regression is. This regression includes all the nudge treatment effects. So all of those red dots from both of the samples. One could have a 7 percentage point, 1, 2, 1, -3. So you can see the constant is the average treatment effect unweighted in the nudge unit sample, 1.38. That's what we said. And in the academic journal is 7 percentage points higher, right? Is 8.7 minus 1.4. Now, what happens if you control for just 2 variables, really 1? What if you control for statistical power, the minimum detectable effect? It gets a huge coefficient and it knocks down the difference from 7 to 2 percentage points. So basically, it looks like when you look at the published papers that are well statistically powered, now they don't look that different from the nudge units. They're still larger, but not that different. You can do another reweighting for publication bias to bring that down further to 1.4 if you do both together. Now, you can also control for some of the features of the intervention, like simplification in person, that also shrinks the gap. So if you put together difference in features and what we term, perhaps improperly, publication bias, basically you get the same number. And so the difference is not significant anymore. And I want to show a different way to do it, because both to show it's robust and to show you another result. The previous one added controls for the variables. This one instead is a propensity score exercise with reweighting by statistical power, reweighting by publication bias, whether you're significant or not, and then reweighting by features of the studies. This also shrinks the combo of the two, basically makes the two studies the same, like the group of studies really shrinks it to 0. But also I want to stress something else, which is the blue area. I want to stress that in the BIT nudge units, all this reweighting doesn't really change the point estimate. It goes from 1.4 to 1.1 to 1.8. So the BIT nudge estimate is really not that sensitive to this reweighting. It's the published ones that seems to shrink towards the 1.4, 1.5. So in some sense, kind of the number for all the trials run, including possibly the bad ideas, but exposed, but all the trials run, that's an estimate we feel pretty confident about. And we suspect that some of the difference with the published papers is the selective publication.
Stefano, quick question. There are a lot of people in the Q&A group who are wondering about the temporal nature of the estimates. In particular, they're wondering if, using a specific experimental window, and maybe academics and the nudge unit might have a different objective function in terms of trying to produce a longer run result versus a shorter run result. If you could comment on what you see in your data, and also what you're doing to try to address that comparison. And again, I think this all comes down to understanding the structure of the incentives of the groups and what their objective functions are. Maybe you can take another shot at that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Actually, we did not do that. We did not code like how long run or short run. So I think we could do it at least for a randomized subset of the intervention, if not for all of them, to compare the mean of the two. That's a great idea. So that's something that we can add. I don't, right now, I couldn't tell you off the top of the head how permanent or not this is. I can tell you that for the nudge unit interventions, most of it comes from the pre-registration. So it is whatever they, with the unit they collaborate with, they decided it's a relevant outcome. Because, obviously it's the Bureau of Labor, that comes in, or the Department of Veteran Affairs, and says, we're interested in this. So you could argue that it means that the nudge units have a harder variable to address, but we can try to look at that. That's a great idea.
Related to that, Stefano, so
yeah,
quickly, just relate to that is, so there's a few questions about, are like the sort of the costs of the behavior different between the two? And when you looked at the averages of the control take up between the BIT studies and the academic, the BIT studies had a lower control take up. So is there something like fundamental difference in the cost of the behavior between the two types?
Yeah, it's a good question too. We tried to do a little bit of that. It doesn't seem like there is a huge effect of the control take up on the treatment effect. So otherwise we kind of have that as a matching variable too. But yeah, I agree that there is potentially kind of a number of other things. So some of it we've done, some of it we could do more on. Let me just, given I only have a couple minutes, let me just highlight one or two other things. The first one is, now, publication bias could matter among the nudge units. So 12 papers were written up. How do those look like? Do you also get 8 percentage points and so on? Turns out you don't actually. The average there is 1.1 percentage points. So it's about the same as for the whole set. And we're like, whoa, how is that strange? Is it is there no selective writing up of papers? Turns out there is actually. This is the Andrews and Casey way of showing it, but part of the point is, without going into detail, is you see there's way more dots here that are to the right of this apex than there are in here, which are the insignificant ones. So among the ones that were written up, it looks like there's publication bias, but we actually do a simulation without going into all the details here. Here's the point of it, which is if you have publication bias, but you're well statistically powered, and you don't have too much heterogeneity or treatment effects, the amount of publication, amount of bias in the point estimate you get from publication will be about maybe 1/3 of a percentage point. But if you run statistically underpowered studies with wide heterogeneity, then the published studies will be wildly different from the studies that represent the average. So in a way, this is it's kind of what we think is interesting, the interaction between statistically powered even and the publication bias. It's like it's important to consider both of those together. So let me just wrap up with just this last thing, which is we also ask, this is a long-standing interest of mine, and we kind of have a beta version of a platform to do this, to get researchers and non-researchers to forecast the treatment effect. So let me just end up this. So we got on social media, so we didn't bug people individually, but people were interested in this. A bunch of you, maybe some of you forecasted the impact of the nudges. So this is what we got. It's kind of interesting to compare to the results. So people made two predictions. One, they predicted, this is the CDF, what would be the impact for the academic journal nudges, the one where it's 8 percentage point, and they're right on. You know, the mean is 8, the median is 6 percentage point. They kind of know, those are the papers, you know, we've read them, it's 6-8 percentage point, and they're exactly right. When it comes to predicting the nudge unit interventions, though, for one reason or another, they're expecting like 4 percentage point. So it's like way larger. Basically, and part of the reason I think it's important to know it's not like that is because otherwise, let's say that Rob, John, me, we're running intervention with the nudge unit and we get 2 percentage point, and the referee says, oh, that's way too small. And the point is that, well, actually, it could be like a pretty large point estimate, at least compared to the full sample of things that are run. So we think it's kind of interesting to know people are expecting 4, and I'll end on this. This is the same forecast as the blue line, but it's split by 3 groups. These are the people that ran field experiments. This was me 10 years ago, not having run any field experiment. And these are people that have run a bunch of field experiments. And then we actually had enough people that worked in nudge units. The more field experiments you run, the more correct you are, the lower a number you expect. Basically, the nudge practitioners are right on. They expect 1.9 percentage point. The result is 1.4. But, you know, we're close to that. So part of the point here is, if you've done this, you kind of know what's a reasonable thing to expect, and that's fine, and maybe this will help. But I think part of what this is doing is, if you're looking at a set of interventions, a number like 1.5, which is really cost effective and it's highly statistically significant. I mean, it's a sizable info, we can tell, but that's kind of a realistic number. The 8 percentage point, it kind of relies on getting the things all worked out right and maybe some degree of noise. So that's part of what I think we're trying to, I think what we're seeing in the paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano.
I'll put the conclusion, but I'll open up to Q&A.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Stefano. A few of the questions that were coming out was, could you like talk a little bit about the sort of, is there much selection going on between these nudge units saying, okay, we've piloted the idea, we think it works really, really well, now we'll partner with an academic to like scale up a little bit. So is a selection of the academics rather than saying the academics coming in and designing the study? Like which way does selection kind of go, do you think?
It is a really interesting question, the one that you're implicitly raising, which is like, what triggers a randomized trial and how does that fit into maybe the next step, you know? But I think that it would go both ways, in the sense that, as we understand, some of these nudge unit studies are coming from a department, from a city that says, hey, we have a problem with people not recycling enough. We've heard about this Bloomberg Philanthropy, what works with cities initiative. Can we do something about it? And the nudge unit might say, oh yeah, your letter, pardon me, sucks. And so we can change that. Or they might say, oh, you know, I know this guy who is an academic at this university who was looking for a study and might be able to help. Or, you know, on another one, I was at one point on a call with Maya Shankar back in the days, interested in reference dependence in job search. And I say, well, okay, so could you do that? So I think it goes all kind of ways, but nudge units have been, I mean, look what they've done here. They've been really open to researchers. They're trying to, it kind of tries to go back and forth. And part of what they're providing in this case is what I don't think any of us has really done, which is write up the result of every study we've run. I mean, that's really awesome. I think that's what I'm really grateful. I think there is very few opportunities like that. And so that, again, might include some bad ideas. This is not an estimate of the most we can do with nudges, because you could double up on the ones that work. You could take the most significant arm. The 1.5 is like a lower bound in a way, but we're grateful that somewhere there is like a big data set like that, because, you know, I know that even trying to write up the null results, some you're like, oh, I would need to fix this and that. I'm not convinced, and you don't write it up, even if you try to do your best. And I think what's remarkable here is they really opened up and did that.
So Stefano, this is a question from David McKinsey, which I think is an excellent question. He asks, how should we think about targeting of treatments and treatment effect heterogeneity here? And he says, I'm thinking of the O-Power experiments, which you're surely aware of Hunt Alcott's excellent work that shows that O-Power shows the populations that will have the biggest treatment effects, either by mistake or on purpose. So he's wondering, is part of the issue that nudge units are not very selective in who they are trying to nudge, whereas academics are?
Yeah.
I think this comes down to the foundational question about objective functions and understanding the difference between them. And
no,
trying
that's
to
great.
shed light on what results mean here.
By the way, that was the Hunt Alcott QJE paper on O-Power I was citing earlier on for that. On that, by the way, I love that paper. I would say that the undersung hero in that paper is the fact that all the treatment effects are between 1.5 or like 1.2 and 2.2. So in fact, it's not like they reverse. So there is this heterogeneity, but there is also way more consistency than you would have thought, particularly given some of the noise. So yes, so Hunt Alcott does find that the early adopters of O-Power and the cities that are more liberal and more predicted with bigger treatment effects adopt a little sooner. So there is some of that. But it also finds a big consistency here. It's a little hard question to ask. So one thing we can say is the early experiments that they ran and the late experiments have the same treatment effects when you control for everything else. So it doesn't look like it's either all vanished or they doubled it up. Maybe that's one thing we can say. What's harder is, one limitation of this data set is we don't have the micro data for each trial. We have treatment and control, you know, zero, because with 0-1, but that means that we can't tell, okay, are they looking at the population that we know is more on the margin of recycle or more the margin of retirement saving compared to the academic study? It's a little hard in this data set to really go all the way from published papers and trials because there is a lot of differences. So maybe some future work would be able to do that. That's certainly a possibility that the nudge units were more constrained. I'm not sure that we could address that much further.
Okay, thanks. So we have, I know Colin has a wonderful question. I'm going to first start with Christina Gravert, has an excellent question, I think. She says, is it interesting that the nudge units have an average lower control take-up, if she's reading the graph correctly? Could be that they focus on more serious problems in the academics, the behavior that's harder to change, thus also smaller effect sizes. If you could comment on that, and then I'll have Rob go ahead and read Colin's question.
Yeah, so I think this is similar to the question Rob was also asking. He was trying to get, you can see here we lined it up with control take-up. One reason actually initially is because I was interested in comparing the implications of persuasion rates versus logit models versus, in the end, the curve, the best fit curve here is fairly flat, but if you look at the very low take-up, those are hard behaviors to move, right? I agree with the question that is asked. The percentage point effect is a little smaller. In percent effect is huge. That's why we get the log odds estimate that is bigger. But yeah, it's possible. But if we basically condition, I think some of the regressions we condition, you can look at, you can match on the control take-up. Indeed, I think you shrink a little bit of that difference, but I think that per se would not shrink it very much. But that's one thing that we should do.
Right. Yes. So Colin Cameron has a question about publication bias with respect to your study, Stefano. So thinking about the objective function of the journals versus the authors of these papers. So so you're saying, since we have two editors here, one of the JPE, it seems like economics authors are happy to write up papers. I'm trying to publish null results, so maybe like unconventional findings or surprising findings. But the publication bias might come from referees, and it might come from editors who maybe don't find the results to be exciting enough for the pages in their journals. So could you sort of just talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah. This is you know, this is an important question. I think that we've done some progress in publishing null effects that are precise. I think that's kind of part of the crusade for me in doing predictions is if you predict an effect to be 4 percentage point and you get a precise 0, then it's not a null, you reject 4%. So part of my crusade in getting predictions is also to make fewer things what people call null effects, because really if you have a precise one answer, but I mean, we can all have the crusades, but the question is, what does the discipline do? So I think that to some extent we have more outlets for things that are precise, null, small studies. That's probably part of the idea of having short papers come back, but that's something that is always going to be there. Now here there is an interesting debate, which is, you would think like on the one hand you would say, oh, we'd like to have an outlet to publish everything, but then journals also want to find things that are new and innovative and maybe in a striking way. And so there is some sense in which what I'm calling publication bias, some of it is true. You want to pick up the successful nudges that have big effects, but part of the point of this paper is that if you do that with underpowered studies, then you're quite a bit likely to pick up just noise. And so that's why you have to be careful. So I'm not really giving a good answer to Colin, because this is one of those long-standing questions that is good for us to keep in the back of the mind, but I think it's good for us to think about it.
Great, thanks, Stefano. So I think we've got like a couple minutes left. I'll turn it over to John if you have any more questions, but just before everyone shoots off, and you might have missed me at the start because it was on mute, unfortunately, is we will post this presentation on our website so you can review it afterwards. And we will hopefully have a larger room for next week. So those on Facebook could come into the room and take part in the Q&A as well. So just want to say thank you to Stefano. I'll turn over to John for any concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I want to start by saying thank you, Stefano, and thanks everyone for participating and being part of the group. I'll just end with one question. So I think scaling is an area that represents, I think, one of the important pieces of advice we can give to policymakers and firms and entities interested in either horizontally generalizing or vertically generalizing. I think these are both under the tent of the science of using science. So what do you think we learn? What should the policymakers on this call or this presentation take from or learn from your work on the threats to scalability or the science of using science? What would you like them to take away?
Well, okay, that's one thing is, it's awesome when the policymakers and so on also create a data set that the researchers never have with all this. So first of all, we are grateful that that is happening. And I think more of this transparency would be great. The second is nudges really do work. I mean, even without selecting the better ones, whatever, 1.5 percentage point, if all you're doing is changing a letter you were sending out in any case, that was the point of the Benarzi et al., that it is high cost effective. But the third point is, if a policymaker is hoping with simplification to tripole something, well, that's a bad call. You know, I think we want to have realistic expectations as policymaker, as referee, as editor, as author, of how do we think, what should we think is realistic statistical power. So that's also why I would think if somebody's designing a nudge and it's a good idea to have as minimum detect effect size 10 percentage point is probably not a good idea. And so something closer to the lower single digits is helpful. So I think those are all kind of combination of things we can do. I certainly would say the lesson is not that nudges don't work. They do work in a pretty reliable way. And they give us an estimate along the lines. I think somebody like Richard Taylor before had said about 2 percentage points. It's pretty close, right, for simplification. If you want more, then we're going to do bigger redesigns like defaults or things like that. I think those are maybe all lessons.
Excellent. So thank you so much. And everyone have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy, remain productive.
Thank you all. That was
again, Stefano.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stefano. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.